I read this week somebody said, let's take a mulligan on 2020 and start again. And I think that's probably how a lot of people feel. You know, things don't always turn out like we expect. Things don't always turn out like we expect. That's the experience of so many people today in the world with everything that's going on. For us, the emotion of it all really hit last Friday. Friday's usually my day off, and we took the day to drive out to the Rocky Mountain National Game Reserve, and we drove around their little drive there, and we saw the buffalo, and we saw the deer, and we saw an eagle, and we saw some other numerous other kinds of birds, and it was just a lovely day to take a drive, and it was a good way to get out. They are open, so if you need a drive, you need to get away from the house, there's a good opportunity. But we came back and we decided to grab a bite to eat at Santiago's, and we had on our mind we were going to get rellenos and covered in green chili, and so we placed our order, and we asked if they had crispy rellenos because it wasn't on their drive-up menu, and the gal said, no, we don't have any of those at this store, and so we ordered the soft rellenos, and she said, well, we don't have any rellenos at all, we ran out, and so we all kind of hemmed and hawed and changed our order. And then we got up to the window, and she said, I didn't tell you we're out of rice, so do you want extra beans on your tray, or what do you want with that? And so it just kind of hit us all at once, the emotion of nothing is right. And we got home, and I'd ordered half and half chili, and if that was their half and half chili, it was hotter than some of their hot chili I've had before by a long ways. And so it was pretty wild. But we all had meals we enjoyed, but just on that drive home, there was that emotion, that letdown of nothing's right. Everything is not like it should be, and it just hit us hard that day. You know, sometimes when those things happen, we begin to think, well, maybe God isn't at work. But you know, even when God is at work, things don't seem to be what we expect sometimes. That was true of Job. That was true of the prophet Habakkuk and the prophet Jeremiah. That was true of Naomi. She called herself bitter. That was her nickname for herself because her life had been bitter. It wasn't what she expected. And of course, that was the experience of the disciples of Jesus as well. When things didn't turn out with Jesus quite like they expected, it turned out to be better. But for a while, I'm sure there was that disappointment, that letdown. And so it was also true of Israel when they were in Egypt. God was beginning to work in their midst, but it wasn't the kind of thing that they expected it to be. And we want to look at that story today. We're beginning a new series today. I debated if while we're still in exile, do we want to start something new? And I did that short series on hope the first few weeks that we were live stream only. But just decided the last couple weeks of that, it doesn't matter. We just need to go ahead and move on. And so we're moving into a spring and summer series. I've called it Drawn Out, which is about the life of Moses. And it's going to take us all the way through the end of summer. Now, some of those dates are up in the air because we have 2 missionary visits scheduled of missionaries we've supported for years, and those travels and visits are up in the air, and have a couple vacations that I have planned in for the summer, which are still up in the air. So we don't know how all that's going to work, but we're going to spend this spring and this summer looking at the life of Moses, drawn out, and look at what God did through that man, probably one of the most influential men that ever lived, a man who was absolutely brilliant, a man who wrote more of your Bible than any other person, and a man who every kingdom since he lived has been impacted by the things that he wrote. And so we're going to take some time to look at his life, but today we want to see some background to that story. And that background is that God was at work, but it wasn't what the people expected. In fact, twice in the text, it says the Egyptians ruthlessly made them slaves. That's not what they expected when God was at work, but that's what happened. That story is in Exodus chapter 1 as background to the story of Moses. And we begin with this. The time had almost arrived for God to act decisively in history. Now, that's not just hindsight because we know the end of the story. That is sight because God had told Abraham many years before what was going to happen. If you go back to God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, you'll read these words. Genesis 15:13, the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. You see, God had said numerous years before that his people Abraham's descendants would be in a foreign land for 400 years, and the time had almost arrived for God to move. God had told Jacob in Genesis 46 that in Egypt he would make Jacob into a mighty nation. He said, go ahead and go down there, and while you're there, I'll make you into a mighty nation. And God was doing what he had promised to do. God was doing what he had promised to do. Look at verse 7 of Exodus chapter 1. It says, the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Exactly what God told Jacob back in Genesis chapter 46, that while you're there, you'll increase in number. You will grow as a family into a nation. That's exactly what God was doing. It's interesting that in the verse I just read, Exodus 1:7, there are three words that I think are a deliberate repeat of Genesis 1:28. Genesis 1:28, God told Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Those same three phrases are in verse 7 that I just read to you. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's exactly what God was doing. So God is working. But in the short term, it may not seem that way to the people involved. It may not seem that way to them. You see, God was changing the world scene. In verses 8 and 9, we find out what God was doing on the world scene. It says in verse 8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. God was changing the world scene. First, a new king arose in Egypt. You can read in there a new dynasty is probably what that means. Probably the 18th dynasty, which began ruling in the mid-1500s, BC. They had kicked out a bunch of foreign rulers in Egypt known as the Hyksos rulers, foreigners that had ruled Egypt for over 100 years. And finally, Egypt was able to expel them, and they established a new dynasty, which we know as the 18th dynasty. The Hyksos people were Semitic peoples who ruled Egypt for that century or more. And I'm sure that this new Pharaoh and his sons after him were very leery of Semitic people because of the century that preceded them. And it goes on to say this new king did not know Joseph. Did not know Joseph. He didn't know the history of the Israelite people in Egypt. He didn't know how for 300 years they had been welcomed and given some of the best land in Egypt. He didn't know that history, or if he did, he just plain didn't care. You see, these were foreign people, and he had no intent on keeping them as citizens of Egypt. He was acting out of fear of these people, that they might do something to destroy him. Listen to verse 10. It says there, come, this is what Pharaoh says, come, let us deal shrewdly with the Israelites, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape the land. Let's do something against these people. Let's act shrewdly against them, because they might raise up with our enemies and destroy us and escape. And so he was acting out of fear. He viewed Israel as a huge threat to him. And so what Pharaoh does in these next few passages is three attempts to get rid of to get rid of what God was doing, to fight against what God was doing. Now, he probably didn't consciously think I'm fighting against God, but he made three attempts to stop what God was doing. I want you to see what those are. The first attempt to thwart God's movement is in verse 11. He said he would afflict them with heavy burdens. Verse 11. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Afflict them with heavy burdens. He appointed taskmasters over them, not just to see over the work. In fact, it very specifically says he appointed taskmasters to the purpose of afflicting them with heavy burdens. Now, that's not what Israel expected, was it? If God is beginning to work in history, that's not what they would have expected to happen. They were comfortable in Egypt. They had a great living there for 300 years. The old Puritan commentary, Matthew Henry, says, the place of our satisfaction may become the place of our affliction. That can happen in any of our lives when we get comfortable where we are, and that's exactly what happened to the Israelites here. What Pharaoh was doing is trying to keep them from multiplying even more because he thought there were too many people. And usually people under oppression don't multiply. But that's not what happened here. In fact, verse 12 tells us his attempt had failed. But, verse 12 begins, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. It's often been the case that when God's people are persecuted, they grow. It's certainly true of the church of Jesus Christ. As that church has been persecuted, it grew. In fact, the early church used to say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It's what makes the church grow. And that's what was happening with God's people way back in the beginning chapters of Exodus. And the result is it caused even more fear among the Egyptian people. Verse 13 and 14 says this, because they were in dread of the people, they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Life was bitter, life was hard, and these people were ruthless in the way they treated them as slaves. In fact, it says that 2 times. Things just got harder for God's people. Pharaoh's attempt to stop God failed, but from the people's view, things were getting harder, and it probably didn't appear to them like God was at work. Let me take a couple of asides on this point, because there's a couple of things I want to point out. And the first aside is this: how leaders respond to a threat will impact how the general public responds to a threat. Listen to that again. It's so appropriate today. How leaders respond to a threat will impact how the general population responds to a threat. Pharaoh was threatened by the people of Israel, and he responded in fear. And what did the people do? They responded in fear. In fact, their fear was greater than Pharaoh's fear. It's true of the COVID threat that we're facing today, that how our leaders deal with this threat will determine how the general population deals with this threat. And I have to make a confession here. I've watched our president and I've watched our governor, not all the time, not all their news conferences, obviously, but as I see bits and pieces of them on the news each night. And I have to admit that even though I totally disagree with the politics of one of those men, I think both of those men have done an admirable job in terms of keeping a sound mind and listening to the experts around them and trying to make some extremely difficult decisions. But if they act in fear, that's exactly how the people react, and more so. That's what Pharaoh did. He didn't keep his head about the matter. Another note I want to make on this point is a historical note, just asking the question, what cities did these people build? And when was the Exodus? Because if you read verse 11, it says they built the city of Ramses. And I said that I believe the Exodus came in the 15th century, the mid-1400s. And how could they have built the city of Ramses if Ramses came 2 centuries after that? It makes great Hollywood drama to say that the Exodus happened in the reign of Ramses II, the great, one of the most powerful kings of Egypt. It was the Prince of Egypt movie. It was the 1923 Ten Commandments movie. It was the 1959 Ten Commandments movie. It's what some people, interpreters have said over the years, that it happened during the reign of Ramses II. But if you add up the dates from Abraham forward, and if you add up the dates from the building of the temple backwards, when the scripture says the temple was completed in the 480th year after the Exodus, you'll find out the Exodus had to happen somewhere in the mid-1400s, not in the 1200s when Ramses was the king. And so what do we do about this? There's both trains of thought and interpreters that go both ways. But one of the key evidences that they were there in the 1200s was that they built the city of Ramses. Well, let me explain that. It's what's called a gloss. It's very common. Well, for instance, I read a book recently about the life of Sam Houston and the battle he fought for the freedom of Texas after the Alamo. And I kept looking at the maps going, where is this battle that took place? Where is that relative to the city of Houston? And when I got out a contemporary map of Texas, I found out that battlefield is right in the middle of the city of Houston now. But there wasn't a city of Houston at that time. It was obviously named after the man who won that battle for them. But if you ask somebody, where did the battle for Texas freedom take place? They'll say it took place in Houston. It's not because that's where it was at the time. It's because that's what's there now, and that's what people understand. And so it's easy to say that this was a gloss that some editor later on said, well, where were they building when they were building? They were building what's now the city of Ramses. And so that's probably what happened in that verse. And the Exodus, I believe, took place a couple hundred years before that. By the way, the picture that's up there and the one that was up on the last slide are actual Egyptian pictures that came from the 18th dynasty. And the one that's up there now shows slaves making bricks and building with bricks. And we don't know if those are Hebrew slaves. Some people guess they are. Other people say they're Nubian because they're darker skinned for the most part. But that's an actual Egyptian painting from that dynasty. And so you might find that kind of interesting. If you like this dating kind of stuff, if you're really interested in some evidence for the Exodus and for the life of Moses, I would recommend to you two movies. Both of them are called Patterns of Evidence. The first one is Patterns of Evidence Exodus, and the second one in the series is Patterns of Evidence Moses. And he talks about the archaeological evidence for the Exodus and why it happened in the 1400s, not in the 1200s. And it's a great, great movie. I would encourage you to get those and take a look at those. Well, enough historical note. Pharaoh's first attempt to thwart God's movement was simply afflict these people with heavy burdens. Here's his second attempt to thwart God's movements, and this is a desperate move. He's to stop the growth of Israel altogether. It begins in verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Pharaoh's taking an extremely desperate move. We call it infanticide. And almost every culture in history has looked down on infanticide. One of the criticisms of this story is that there's no way that two midwives could have served the number of people that are reported to be in Israel at this time. But more than likely what Pharaoh did is he brought in the two women who were kind of the leaders of all of the midwives, somewhat like the supervisors of those midwives. And he brought them in and he said, here's what you're supposed to do. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a daughter, let her live. Pharaoh probably thought these simple women would be easily persuaded by his authority. It's probably what he thought. They're simple women. They'll be persuaded by my authority when they come into my court and hear my commands, but he didn't count on them answering to a higher authority than him. Verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. The midwives feared God, and so this second attempt of Pharaoh failed as well. He didn't count on them answering to a far higher authority than him. In fact, he couldn't even imagine that there was a higher authority than him, and he thought they would cower in front of him. But they revered God, who is the author of life, and so they valued life above the authority of Pharaoh, and they disobeyed what he said. Now, that brings up another aside, a question that comes up when we see this in a couple other passages in Scripture. And the question is, did these women lie and get commended for it? Did these women lie and were commended for it? And the simple answer is yes, they did. Now, I've read some commentaries that try to excuse what they were doing in all kinds of ways, saying they weren't lying because of this or this and et cetera. And I think they completely watered down what happened. I mean, Pharaoh comes and says, why didn't you kill the boys? And they feed him a story. But there are times, and they are very rare, but there are times when a higher value may necessitate a lie. We see it in Scripture in 3 times. We see it with Rahab, who told the authorities in her city about this, lied about the spies who'd come to see her. We see it here with the midwives in Egypt, and we see it once in the life of David when he told a lie to the high priest. Here's what's happening in every one of those stories. We talked about it when we went through Judges and saw the story of Rahab. In every one of those stories, innocent lives were at stake. And had the truth been told, innocent lives would have died. And I think it's very rare when that happens. But there may be times when innocent lives are at stake, when people need to lie in order to protect those lives. Well, enough of that aside. Pharaoh tried a desperate move to get rid of or to stop the growth of the Israelites, and that failed. And so here's his third attempt, and it's an even more desperate move than all of the others. Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. He's getting even more desperate because he bypasses the midwives, and he tells his whole kingdom, look, start killing the Hebrew baby boys. He gave permission for a mass genocide in Israel. That's what he did. He gave permission for a mass genocide. Following an order like that would have led to total chaos. Not to mention the fact that over time he would have wiped out his labor force. And we don't know how well the people obeyed or whether they kept their heads and said, that's ridiculous, we aren't going to do that. We don't know. We do know this. There's one person who disobeyed. Pharaoh's own daughter disobeyed that command. And that sets the stage for the rest of the story. This too failed, whether the people followed through or not. This attempt of Pharaoh failed as well. And the story is the rest of the book of Exodus that tells us how that attempt failed. It begins with Pharaoh's daughter disobeying that command. And we're going to look next week at how that worked out. Well, here's the last aside, one with this point as well. Very briefly, this will not be the last time in history when an insecure king tries to stop God's work by killing babies. It will not be the last time. You remember what happens when Herod the Great heard that a Messiah might have been born and killed all the babies in Bethlehem. It's something that threatened leaders do. But God continues to do his work. Just like under Herod the Great, God protected the one child that Herod wanted to kill. So here, God continued to work and brought out the child that he wanted to bring out. We'll look at that next week. But before we do, here's kind of the big idea from this week's lesson. God works through history to carry out his plans. He works through kings. He works through nations. He works through the hearts of his own people and even the hearts of those who aren't his. God works through history to carry out his plan, but it isn't always what we expect. It isn't always what we as God's people expect. In fact, in this case, it turned out to be hardships, slavery, bitterness. But here's what happened. Those hardships brought about a strong desire for freedom in the hearts of God's people. That's something they needed to have for what God was doing. It brought about a strong desire for freedom. But something else it did. It brought about a baby boy who would be educated as a royal Egyptian and come back to set his people free. God used this tyranny, this affliction to bring about the situation that he needed to do the work that he wanted to do. God is working in history right now. God is working in history right now, and to many of us it looks like hardship, particularly those of us that have felt the sickness or been affected by the COVID sickness. For all of us, because we're at stay-at-home orders, many of us, it looks like hardship. But God knows the end from the beginning. And he is working through this situation to bring about his purposes. We may not know what those are, But we can be assured that God works through history to carry out his plan, even if it's not what we expect. And that's what God is doing right now in our world. Well, let's share some applications of that lesson. I have a question. How do we respond to hard times? How have you responded so far to the hard times we're facing? Hard times may be God at work in your life, or God at work in history. Hard times may just be that. In fact, if we really believe that God is God, then all of the hard times we face are God working in some way or another. Here's some potential responses to hard times. A couple of them come from this story, and others, the other one I just kind of thought of. Number one, we can oppose God and fight. We can oppose God and fight when we're facing hard times. That's exactly what Pharaoh did, and that's what the people of Egypt followed him in doing. You know, a lot of rulers in history have tried to fight what God is doing. You know what God does when that happens? He just laughs. Listen to the words of Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. But he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. All of these kings try to oppose what God is doing in the world. He just sits in the heavens and laughs, because he knows who's in control and who has the real power. Psalm 2 ends with these words, now therefore, kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. We can fight God or we can work with him. And sometimes we oppose God and fight with him when hardships come our way. And that's probably particularly true of people in authority. I think we fight God sometimes because we want control. That's what Pharaoh wanted. He wanted to be in control. And that's why we fight God sometimes. But only God is in control. I was talking about this sermon with my phone meeting with Carrie Ann this week, and she says, maybe that's what happened with the toilet paper and the hand sanitizer. And I had to laugh because that's probably exactly true. You know, we want to be in control. We want to control the situation. And so we buy up all the hand sanitizer, all the toilet paper, so we can have some control over a situation we really can't control. I think that's why we fight God sometimes, is because we want the control. But he is a sovereign God. We can oppose God and fight. Another thing we can do is become self-righteous. Now, I don't see that happening in this particular story. It does happen in Exodus chapter 5, and we'll look at that in a few weeks, when Moses actually comes back to Egypt to set the people free. And they look down their noses at him like, who are you to come and do this job? They put themselves in a self-righteous position. Some Christians say that right now God is pouring out his wrath on the world through this sickness. I don't know if that's true or not. But usually when people say that, not always, but usually when people say that, it comes from a heart of self-righteousness. It comes from a heart of pride that says, we are God's people and we're protected. God is pouring out his wrath on everyone else. Everyone else is wrong. That's often, in my experience, where that heart comes from. We can become self-righteous. We can oppose God and fight. Another thing we can do is blame God as cruel. Look what God is doing. God is cruel. I don't see that in this story, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's where a lot of the Israelite people were with their hearts, thinking God is cruel because he promised a redeemer, and look what's happening to us. All I can say is we don't know what God is doing because